Hey everyone, let's talk about whiskey. Not the drink, though that would be fun too. Let's talk about the little continuous deployment tool that I wrote, that I called Whiskey, um, that I'm using for lots of different things. The origin, the genesis of it was basically I would use GitLab CI to build a lot of my projects. In some cases, there isn't really much of a build process. It might be PHP or something like that. But then I want to deploy it to a machine, right? It's not necessarily in a Docker container or a Docker image or any sort of container image. Um, and I'm not necessarily using a service like ECS or um, whatever the Google or Azure version is, AKS, EG. GKS, I don't know. But basically, I have files that I need to install somewhere and then run. Um, Very simple, straightforward, um, nothing fancy, but typically there's an SSH connection involved. And realistically, there's nothing truly that requires that there be a file that gets transferred. You could use Whiskey to SSH into a particular machine and invoke some Docker magic or invoke some Kubernetes magic if you wanted to. Um, it is really intended to be very flexible, and it is open source. So I'm actually going to pull up uh, the Git repository and show you because that's probably the easiest way to show you exactly what it does. It is designed to be kind of something that fades into the background. So the idea is that you create this uh, YAML file because apparently it's the law that modern configuration files have to be YAML. And it basically is segmented into discrete sections, and they mimicked the sections or the pattern that I was using for deploying my own applications. Basically, define a list of artifacts, and literally it says what files should get copied across from local to remote. So one of the things you specify uh, in your um, build script is basically you grab a copy of Whiskey, you run it against this file, and it says, okay, I will copy this stuff up to a particular remote or set of targets, which are listed here. And then on each target, it's going to go out and deploy them. So deploy base indicates where on the machine uh, each item should be deployed, and then the rest indicates how each artifact should be deployed, or the collection of artifacts should be deployed. So I divided it into four steps: copy, build, post inst, and restart. And basically, the copy step is how we turn the artifacts that were created into the new deployment directory, the new deployment. So Whiskey automatically creates this $deployed dir environment variable, um, which is where the new deployment should end up. And you can see the comment here. If deploy dir does not exist after this step, or it is not a directory, deployment fails. So basically, Whiskey says, here's where the new deployment will live, and it is your responsibility to set up commands here. You can see copy, I make a directory at that location, and then I create or I copy a file into it, right? You could also unzip a file, right? Example.tar.gz. You could unzip that and move a folder to that location. I do that a lot on for a lot of these deployments. Um, but basically, there has to be some step that creates a directory at that particular location. Um, and then if there's a build step, um, you can, and at this stage, you can, run node to, or, npm CI or something like that to instantiate a bunch of uh, things, configuration, or in that case, node packages, that sort of thing. And the comment here, what should we do before setting the production symlink to point to the new deployment? Basically, what happens is at a certain point in time, at a certain point in the process, Whiskey moves a symlink from the old deployment to the new deployment, and then presumably there's some restart step, later on, post inst and restart, um, that restarts the application and has either your reverse proxy or something like that pointing to the new deployment. In the case of a process, it just kills the old process and starts the new one. That's basically what this does here in my restart step. Find all the processes that are sh example, kill them, and then just start example again. And I forget what exactly example does, but it's in this repository as well. It's just a simple example. And then post inst is anything that you want to happen after changing the symlink. The idea is that the change of the symlink is the indication that a particular version was successfully deployed, right? So in this case, I'm just putting the date into a file called deployed. Theoretically, I want to save when this particular version was deployed. Maybe that's useful to me. Another thing you could do here is um, run a set of database migrations, or maybe you want to do that as part of the build, potentially. But basically, these are different hooks. Different stages in the process, you can specify things to happen as part of this process. It always happens in this sequence. And if something fails, the whole deployment fails, right? So you don't get left with a broken deployment, at least in theory, right? The one other thing that isn't mentioned in this config file, because they're not really part of this config file, is that you can also put a .config directory inside of your deploy base uh, directory, and put whatever files you want in there. And what happens with that directory is that I believe it's between build and post inst, or between build and setting the symlink to the new deployment. Somewhere in that stage, is it copies all of the files from .config to the new deployment. So that's where you can set things like a config file, right? If you need a config file to uh, carry over from deployment to deployment, or a set of environment variables, or a certificate, right? The private key or something like that. You can stick that in .config, and it'll get copied over into the particular directory. Obviously, depending on your application, that might not strictly be necessary. You might be able to reference a file somewhere else, or a secret or something like that from your deployment. But especially for like legacy applications that were originally built before the idea of containers came around, or you don't want to really think about where you're going to save some of this configuration information, that .config directory can be very helpful. Um, that's basically it. It's intended to be very simple, very straightforward. I take this example configuration into most of the projects that I build. This is how I start deploying before I even deal with, maybe I scale to something like Kubernetes or Elastic Container Services, something like that. But initially, I'm probably just spinning up a VPS and sending files up there using this deployment tool. So one of the things that I didn't really say at the beginning was kind of the motivation behind this. I felt like this was just a gap. There are lots of tools that build themselves as continuous deployment tools, but they're really just continuous integration tools. That, well, I mean, there's that whole debate of what is integration as well. They're basically just script automation tools. They're build process tools, right? There's nothing inherent about them that is deployment, that is continuous deployment. This is continuous deployment. There is, yes, it has a build step. That's not really intended for an entire build process. That's intended for how should we build out this directory on the deployment target. This is very specifically a deployment tool. Um, it has one job and one job only. It is to deploy your application to a particular server. And that's it. So hopefully you found this helpful. If you did, leave a comment down below or a like if you can do that on the platform you're watching this on. And thank you for watching. And let me know if you're interested. It's open source. You can go grab it and run it and try it out. Um, if if you want more information about it, if you want to contribute, let me know. Send me a message or an email or drop a comment down below. Thanks for watching.